Yeah. Hello. Welcome. First, I'd like to introduce the two new members that are here from our two Natural Resources Committee. My dear friend returning, Mr. Horsford from Nevada. Welcome to the committee. Mr. Case from Hawaii. I think we're going to have a field hearing in your district. Yes. It is absolutely right. Yes, it's critically important that we get around to all the committee, all the unique places for the country. I would just like to thank everyone for coming. Thank the panel. Good morning. This is our Democratic Issues Forum. And it's the title of our discussion is the Trump administration's bias towards the oil and gas industry during the government shutdown. So first I want to say good afternoon to everyone and thank you for joining us at today's forum as we really review the special treatment that the oil and gas industry is receiving during the Trump shutdown. I want to give an especially warm welcome and thanks to all the panelists and colleagues for participating in what I think is a very important and timely meeting. As we all know, it's now 34 days that President Trump and Senator McConnell have held our nation hostage and have inflicted tremendous damage on the economy and the lives of all Americans. For example, services and programs at Indian health centers have faced drastic cuts. The nonprofit groups and the partners and their partners and other partners who are adjacent to national parks that rely on fully staffed and funded public lands are losing millions of dollars in retail sales. And Coast Guard families and other federal workers, many of them who are my constituents, and I've spoken with many of them, they're scrambling to figure out how are they going to afford home payments, mortgage payments, car payments, food. So what we're really saying is that this Trump shutdown has become a crisis. People are struggling, our neighbors are suffering. But throughout it all, while many, many people are suffering and in great pain, the oil and gas industry has remained unscathed. And the administration continues to advance their priorities across the country. This fact should be a surprise to no one, as the Interior Department has been on a deregulatory tear for the past 2 years and has consistently made decisions that benefit the fossil fuel industry at the expense of public health and our environment. Yet, despite running out of money on December 22nd, for the oil and gas industry, the past 5 weeks have been business as usual. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, is moving full speed ahead with developing a new and completely unnecessary national offshore oil and gas leasing program. This is the same offshore program that was seemingly influenced by political considerations under the former Secretary Zinke, and the same plan that would open up over 90% of our oceans to dangerous drilling. There are many unanswered questions concerning former Secretary Zinke's tweet removing Florida from the offshore leasing plan, which is why Chair Grijalva and I sent a letter to Acting Secretary Bernhardt this very morning requesting documents and communications on this very topic. On top of this, BOEM has demanded that employees return to work to prepare for upcoming offshore oil and gas lease sales and to process permits for seismic work in the Atlantic. Luckily, last week, a federal judge halted Interior's work on seismic permits and acknowledged it was ridiculous for the Interior Department to continue this work while claiming that the shutdown prevented them from responding to a related lawsuit. While this was a small victory, The Interior Department is acting on the wishes of the oil and gas industry during this shutdown on many, many fronts. Across the West, the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, is working nearly unimpeded on oil and gas activities near cultural sites and environmentally sensitive areas. Since the start of the shutdown, December 22nd, BLM has approved 22 permits, 15 new leases, and accepted over 220 drilling applications, all while the agency staff remain inaccessible to the general public and inaccessible to interested stakeholders. Federal laws, including the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the National Historic Preservation Act, require that agencies conduct legally compliant environmental reviews, consult with tribes, and hold comment and protest periods. It's unclear to us if BLM is fully abiding by these requirements, but the agency's actions during the shutdown raise serious legal concerns that need to be examined. In Alaska, the shutdown has barely slowed the BLM's efforts to open millions of acres of new sensitive lands to oil and gas development. The BLM held public meetings in early January as part of the process required to open more than 23 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve to drilling, and they have refused to extend the environmental review comment deadline for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. While the Interior Department moves forward with oil and gas activities during the shutdown, it is important that we underscore our most significant concerns. As we will hear from today's panelists, this is not a question of supporting or opposing all energy development. It's a question of what the administration has prioritized during the shutdown and what industries and businesses receive preferential treatment. At a time when the shutdown is exacting so much pain on Americans across all walks of life, it is utterly immoral that the Trump administration treats one group of friendly businesses, the fossil fuel industry, as more valuable and deserving than all others. At this point, I'd like to introduce this afternoon's panelists. I think that's, first, we have Governor Curt Riley. Governor Riley is the co-chairman of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, their Natural Resources Committee, and is the former governor of the Pueblo of Acoma. Our second panelist is Dan Pushkar. Mr. Pushkar is the executive director of the Public Lands Alliance. Next, we have Drew McConville. Mr. McConville is the Senior Managing Director for Government Relations at the Wilderness Society. Our fourth panelist is Franz Matzner. Mr. Matzner is the Director of Federal Affairs in the Center for Policy Advocacy at the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. And finally, we have Matt Lee Ashley. Mr. Lee Ashley is the Senior Director for Environmental Strategy and Communications at the Center for American Progress. Mr. Lee Ashley also previously served as the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Department of Interior for Secretary Ken Salazar. And I think we'll begin, if I can open up this page. Is there not another page? Yes, there is. Thank you. So now we're going to move to oral testimony. Governor Riley, you are recognized for 5 minutes now, and thank you for coming.
Chuchin, Kaumats, Kuhimats, Ukchin, Ikutapa. Doing the mesh dish, Atsaya, Uswatanus dish, Stash Huchin, where's this Squinique, they did see Nate Tita Sawatuma. Good morning. I wish to thank, first of all, Chairman Grijalva and the House Natural Resources Committee members for being here today and in giving us this opportunity to present on behalf of the Pueblo of Acoma and the All Pueblo Council of Governors. As was stated, my name is Kurt Riley. I am the former governor for the Pueblo of Acoma and the current co-chair of the Natural Resources Committee of the All Pueblo Council of Governors. I am here at the direction of Acoma Governor Brian Valle, as well as the leadership of the All Pueblo Council of Governors. The 20 pueblos of New Mexico and Texas have grave concerns about oil and gas development surrounding Chaco Canyon National Historic Park, especially without adequate consultation of the tribes. Chaco is a place of extraordinary cultural and spiritual significance to many Pueblo people. Emanating from Chaco Canyon is a rich cultural landscape containing the footprints and fingerprints of our ancestors, as well as natural features woven into our history and our belief system. Last summer, I visited Chaco Canyon with some of my Acoma children, retracing our migratory path, and visited places such as Mesa Verde, Joven Weep, and other ancestral sites. I expressed to the children as they looked at Chaco Canyon in particular, and I asked them, what did it take for our ancestors to live here, but to reflect on their own futures? I told them, look at what our ancestors built. They were astronomers, engineers, mathematicians, farmers, foresters. These attributes are in your genes. What you need to do is go to school and express those genes and get the diploma that it takes to be recognized, but know that our ancestors were already all these things and more. And so when we visit Chaco Canyon, it was with the intent to solidify their perception of who they are and where they come from. As a religious leader, I also know that we visited Chaco Canyon. We still continue to visit Chaco Canyon. These places are not dead, they're not abandoned, they are still currently used within our religious system. The BLM, however, continues to push for rapid oil and gas development in Chaco to the detriment and possible destruction of our cultural resources and sacred sites. In this context, we were alarmed to learn that during the shutdown, federal workers were continuing to process applications for permits to drill. It is shocking to us that while many programs to benefit Native communities have lost funding during the shutdown, the permitting of our ancestral lands continues ahead full speed. While BLM consultation with Pueblos has always been completely inadequate, during the shutdown, this situation has only become far worse. The BLM cannot reasonably justify the processing of oil and gas permits alone while not being able to simultaneously fulfill its other duties under federal law. We cannot help but protest what appears to be an intentional bias in the favoring of oil and gas development over other interests. Let me give you just a few examples of the broader impact of the shutdown on the Pueblos. My written testimony has more details that your staff and yourselves can look at later on. Many of our tribal members, as other federal employees and federal contractors, have been furloughed. Some live paycheck to paycheck and their families are experiencing very real hardship. For those of you that have never come to New Mexico, I invite you to come and visit us. We are a rural community. Jobs are scarce. And when you do have a federal job and now not having that salary income, we are very concerned as to how even our Pueblos can respond to help our Pueblo communities. Other important issues on a national and state level are that our water negotiations, as well as other legal matters, are at a standstill because key federal participants, members of the federal negotiation team, are also furloughed. And meanwhile, cases that are in litigation are delayed because of the U.S. attorneys and their staff not being available. So these are some of the issues and concerns that Pueblo Country is experiencing. And we do thank all of the committee members for listening to us, and I would be open to answer any questions that you have for me. Thank you very much.
Governor Riley. We'll get back to questions. Before I go to Mr. Pushkar, I'd like to offer an opportunity for my other colleagues on the panel, Mr. Horsford first, and then Mr. Case, if you'd like to make an opening statement. Pass. Mr. Case? You want to make an opening statement? No, thank you. Mr. Pushkar, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to share the stories and impacts of this latest government shutdown. My name is Lands Alliance. On behalf of PLA and our members, I implore the administration and Congress to immediately restore funding to our public lands through the end of fiscal year 2019. It's unconscionable that America's national parks, refuges, forests, and conservation areas are being held hostage for an issue that does not affect them. For more than 40 years, the Public Lands Alliance has worked to connect, strengthen, and represent the nonprofit partners of America's public lands. Land management agencies may call them friends groups, cooperating associations, educational centers, field institutes, conservation service corps. These nonprofit organizations have no shareholders, only a public trust to benefit the American people by enhancing our public lands and the experience of visitors. Under normal conditions, our members contribute a great deal back to those public lands, more than $250 million annually. In my testimony today, I cannot highlight the intricacies of oil and gas policy today during the shutdown, but I can talk to how our community is being impacted and what resources we have available to us. Since the shutdown, there has been a change in the way lands have been managed compared to some other longer-term shutdowns. Gates are open. People are free to enter a lot of our most sacred wild spaces. And yet, visitor facilities have been closed. No restrooms, no backcountry permitting. A lot of services have been denied. In the National Park Service, for example, nonprofit partners and others have been given a difficult choice. They want to help visitors who rely on basic visitor amenities to conduct their conservation, education, and recreational programming, and this is the situation they face. They could use their private funds to keep visitor facilities open through donations back to the land management agency with no expectation of getting repaid. Or they could close and suspend their operations, whether that's a store, a learning center, a volunteer program, and reduce their own revenue and deny visitors opportunities. No matter the case, nonprofit partners, the public lands, and the visitors lose. The shutdown has had terrible effects on our community. Many have stepped to the plate to try and keep visitor services open. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent, and again, no expectation of being repaid. More than $4 million has been lost, at least, in retail sales, in visitor programs. More than 500 nonprofit employees have been laid off or furloughed, working without pay. We feel greatly for our agency partners that are suffering through this. We are grateful that Congress has acted to ensure they will get their back pay. Our folks are not so lucky. The ramifications to this shutdown go on and on. In closing the retail stores that nonprofits open and have in all of our national parks, as well as refuges, conservation lands, and forests, not only does the public lose out on the opportunity to have those opportunities, but the small businesses they work with to create specialized products, to create new opportunities, those small businesses are hurting. I speak in my testimony of Wish Designs, a small business in Massachusetts that partners with a number of our members. 85% of their business has been shut down because of the government shutdown, and they are faced with deciding how many workers do they have to lay off. The impacts of this keep going on and on. I could speak at length about many examples. There is a lot in my written testimony, and I'd love to answer questions about it. We worry about the capital projects that our members fund that are in limbo, resulting in project delays and cost escalation. We worry about all the cooperative agreements used by conservation land corps that are going to need to be modified, a slow process these days, before work can be done. We're worried about the hiring freeze on seasonals in our parks and forests, knowing that a lot of visitors are going to want to come this summer and we won't be ready to handle them. We're worried about the use of recreation fees, fees meant to enhance the visitor experience that are now being used to purchase toilet paper, and worry that there will not be funds to be used instead on things like the deferred maintenance crisis. I again ask you, please work with the administration, work with your colleagues to reopen America's public lands, and consider as you do so opportunities to, as you will pay back our federal employees, ensure that these other communities get paid back too. Thank you.
And I wish to thank you too, Mr. Pushkar, and we'll return to questions at the conclusion of the panel. Next, Mr. McConville, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Good afternoon, Congressman Lowenthal, members of the committee. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to share my views today. My name is Drew McConville. I oversee government relations work at the Wilderness Society. Quite simply, what we're seeing during this government shutdown is just how much the Trump administration puts the interests of their well-connected special interests above the public when it comes to managing lands and waters that belong to all Americans. Despite the fact that we hear and read horror stories each day, whether it's about the impacts of the shutdown, whether it's Joshua trees cut down in Joshua Tree National Park, whether it's federal workers having to get by with yard sales to make ends meet, it's become increasingly clear at that very same time the Department of Interior is open for the oil and gas industry. But while Interior staff have been brought back to process drilling permits, advance a controversial policy agenda, the public's been kept in the dark and shut out of land management decisions. This behavior is not only wildly inequitable and illegal, but it endangers the very lands, wildlife, and communities that Department of Interior is supposed to protect. BLM's employees have been called back to serve oil and gas stakeholders, and those efforts are bearing fruit. We heard a few minutes ago about how the numbers are playing out, how quickly they're actually moving through permits and other leasing opportunities and nominations. Meanwhile, planning and leasing processes to open more lands to drilling are continuing at a reckless pace, and comment periods for controversial plans and policies have continued to run. Not surprisingly, the oil and gas industry gives DOI very strong reviews. In an interview just last week, the CEO of ConocoPhillips said, and I'm going to quote him because I think it's powerful, "We're still having conversations with the Department of Interior, EPA, and BLM about our longer-term permitting and things we have in front of them as business. Now, obviously, if this carries on for a longer period of time, we're going to see some slowdown in that activity, but we haven't been materially impacted today." That was 25 days into the shutdown. The exceptional customer service reported by the oil and gas executives stands in pretty stark contrast with the experiences of the general public and others, including folks we've heard from already. Neither DOI nor BLM has provided any information to the public about the status of upcoming lease sales and associated comment and protest periods that should have, including some that should have started already. Limited public hearings chosen to proceed by the agency are either rushed or poorly staffed with limited involvement from agency officials, and some are postponed or canceled with no notice. For example, a series of meetings on the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska was only disseminated to stakeholders, the fact that it was happening, the day before the first public hearing was held. Now, given the logistical challenges of travel in the Arctic region, that's totally unacceptable. Meanwhile, as BLM allows the clock to run on public comment periods, agency staff are unavailable to answer questions for the public. Website outages, missing documents, and other technical problems are recurring. Even attempts to deliver physical comments are being thwarted by closed office buildings. And put quite simply, too much is at stake for the public to be shut out. As this committee well knows, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one of the last truly wild places in America. In the Western Arctic, the administration is now targeting the most sensitive lands too, And lease sales on the books for February and March would put more than 1 million acres up on the auction blocks in 7 states in the lower 48. That's wildlife corridors in Wyoming, recreation hotspots in Colorado, migratory bird habitat, and other special places in New Mexico. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So although most of what's happening behind the scenes remains hidden, what we do know raises very serious questions about the legality of their approach. We have grave concerns about inadequate consideration of environmental and historic impacts as permits are rushed, and particularly while biologists, archaeologists, and other issue experts are furloughed. And shortchanging opportunities for public comment is likely a violation of both the spirit and the letter of the law. In light of the risk posed to our lands, waters, and wildlife and communities, the Wilderness Society believes BLM should immediately halt oil and gas permitting, postpone all lease sales, and extend all comment periods significantly beyond the reopening of the government so the public can meaningfully participate and have a say in their lands. Congress has a vitally important role to play too. And we really appreciate the strong efforts taken by members here today to push for answers and change at Interior. And we are hopeful that Congress will continue to exercise oversight responsibility, investigate questionable decisions, and help to put an end to the culture of industry bias that's pervaded the highest levels at the Department of Interior. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our views today, and I look forward to questions later.
Thank you, Mr. McConville. And now, Mr. Matzner, you have 5 minutes. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the House Natural Resource Committee and staff for the opportunity to participate in today's important forum. My name is Franz Matzner, and I'm representing the Natural Resource Defense Council's 3 million members and activists. As my fellow panelists have articulated, the Trump administration is busy bending over backwards to do the bidding of the oil and gas industry, all while the nation struggles in the face of the longest government shutdown in modern history. The administration has directed Department of Interior staff to barrel ahead with fossil-fueled agenda to expose our coasts to the hazards and harms of offshore drilling. Notably, we've seen no such directive or urgency to pursue offshore wind energy. There is simply no justification for this race to auction off our coasts to drilling. It's yet another example of the Trump administration making the oil industry's wish list priority number 1. The administration's argument that any delay in processing drilling requests carries unsustainable economic consequences is paper thin, and is doubly spurious while the shutdown's impacts on federal employees and their families are all too real. There are 3 primary reasons Trump's drill at all costs mantra is wrong for America. First, there simply is no urgency. We already have a leasing program in place, finalized by the previous administration. Now, the oil industry might not like it, but the federal government has been operating under it just fine for the past 2 years. Nor is there a shortage of oil to justify ramming through new drilling. In fact, the domestic oil industry is exporting more oil than ever, around 7.7 million barrels a day. That's roughly equivalent to 1/3 of domestic demand. Further, finalizing a replacement 5-year plan and leasing itself is a long-term process. Neither happen overnight. And even after leasing, long lead times and large capital investment mean oil from new drilling wouldn't reach pumps for a decade or even longer, especially in remote and challenging environments like the Arctic Ocean. Number 2, oil spills. Drilling would put millions of jobs at risk and threaten marine life from oil spills that are both frequent and disastrous. Keep in mind that in the 7 years since the BP oil spill, the industry has experienced more than 4,000 explosions, fires, collisions, and related incidents, including 34 significant oil spills. And oil does not respect state boundaries. Opening any region to drilling threatens entire coastlines with spills that could devastate hundreds of coastal communities and tens of thousands of businesses. The third reason, climate change. It's happening. The science is definitive, and we must transition to clean energy as quickly as possible, not lock in more carbon pollution that fuels climate change. Expanded offshore drilling would take us exactly in the wrong direction, further underscoring the Trump administration's ongoing denial of this actual, real crisis. There's a last reason, and it's one of the most important. The public does not support expanded drilling. A tidal wave of bipartisan resistance to offshore drilling has overtaken the nation, coast to coast. 1.35 million public comments submitted. Over 200 community and municipalities have passed resolutions. Nearly 200 representatives, 43 senators, and the majority of coastal governors from both parties have spoken out. And polling repeatedly confirms that the majority of Americans want to protect, not drill, our coasts. In sum, the Trump administration's decision to proceed with offshore oil and gas activities despite the government shutdown is as unjustifiable as it is harmful. It underscores a callous disregard of the facts of what the American people want and how drilling would harm communities across the country. Expanded drilling in public waters is vehemently opposed by the public, contraindicated by current science, poses a direct threat to existing local economies, and ignores the many benefits of clean energy. If the president is earnest about wanting to secure America's economy and future, he'd end the shutdown. Stop aiding and abetting the oil and gas industry's quest to lock up our public lands and waters, and quit sidelining clean energy, like offshore wind, that creates jobs, cuts pollution, and doesn't put our coastal communities and climate in harm's way. Thank you very much. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Matzner. Now our final panelist is Mr. Lee Ashley. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal and members of the committee for holding this public forum. Thank you all as well for doing everything you can to end this damaging and costly government shutdown. My name is Matt Lee Ashley. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where I work on natural resource policy. I also had the privilege of working at the Department of the Interior from 2009 to 2012. I served as the Deputy Chief of Staff as the government prepared for 3 potential shutdowns in 2011. All those shutdowns were thankfully averted, but guided by the leadership of career civil servants, the Interior Department and its agencies applied a set of principles to prepare for the chaos that comes in any shutdown. Principle 1, follow the law. The Solicitor's Office at that time was crystal clear that the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits executive branch agencies from spending money that hasn't been appropriated by Congress, period. Principle 2, protect public safety and the resources that Interior is responsible for safeguarding. You cannot safely operate our national parks, wildlife refuges, or national monuments without rangers. It is as simple as that. Principle 3, be fair. Our government is supposed to treat everyone equally, whether the government is open or closed. The Interior Department should never be a political favor factory. Principle 4, be honest and open with the public. The public deserves to know what is going on at the Interior Department at all times. A shutdown is no exception. The responsibility rests with the Secretary of the Interior to clearly explain what is open, what is closed, and why. The Trump administration's Interior Department is following none of these principles. Acting Secretary David Bernhardt is instead bending and potentially breaking the law to protect the oil and gas industry from any interruption in the services of government. Many of these companies are his past lobbying clients. The only way the public has any idea what the Interior Department is doing is if news of some activity leaks out. Secretary Bernhardt's Interior Department is a black box of secrecy. For the American people who are trying to make sense of what the Interior Department is doing today, here's what they see. They see a department working to let oil companies drill off the Atlantic coast while pulling down work to advance offshore wind leases. They see a department that is processing hundreds of drilling permits and speeding ahead with plans to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge while shuttering critical services for tribes across the country, including healthcare, childcare, and contracting support. They see a department that is allowing our national parks, wildlife refuges, and public lands to get trashed, while the leader of the American Petroleum Institute boasts that the oil industry hasn't, quote, seen any major effects of the shutdown. This is not the way government is supposed to work in any circumstance, especially during a major crisis. In the words of a recent complaint that was filed with the GAO, Acting Secretary Bernhardt is very clearly, quote, gaming the system to circumvent the shutdown. So what is to be done about this mess? Until the government reopens, here are 3 recommendations for the Interior Department. First, Acting Secretary Bernhardt needs to come out of the shadows and explain to the public how he is running the Interior Department. He should, at a minimum, be holding daily public media briefings describing what is happening in our parks with our natural resources and with services that affect tribal nations. To my count, since becoming acting secretary, David Bernhardt has not once stood in front of journalists or a public meeting to answer questions. Second, the Interior Department should be providing real-time updates to Congress and the public on how much money it claims to have left in its accounts. They have now repeatedly and magically found leftover money from 2018 to pay for their oil and gas activities. Does this money really exist? Is it being spent as Congress intended? And if so, how long will that money last? Third, the Interior Department should immediately make a blanket extension of all public comment periods that were open during the government shutdown. You cannot expect the public to comment on, say, drilling plans for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge if websites are compromised or if agency staff is not on hand to meaningfully engage in a public process. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you again for holding this forum and for your work to end this shutdown.
Thank you, Mr. Lee Ashley. Now we're going to go to the questioning period, and I was wondering, Mr. Case, would you like to begin? I will recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All of what the questioners have said is of great concern. I think we can all agree that the federal government shutdown, now in its 34th day, has been a deeply concerning and tragic event all around, and that there are impacts, both direct and indirect, across our country. In my home state of Hawaii, for example, we have some of the most beautiful and most popular national parks in our country that are not being accessed right now, historical sites. A governor, a Native Hawaiian, indigenous peoples are affected also through their connection with our government. I want to focus here on the basic premise of this hearing, which is that some parts of our industries out there that deal with interior are being left out of the impacts of the shutdown. And it seems to me that listening to the testimony, there are kind of two categories here. The first category are the continued operations of parts of interior on non-essential basis to process permits and basically to rush things through. That's my impression of your testimony. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the second part that concerns me, also related, is the non-extension of comment periods in an apparent attempt to cut that particular avenue off before the shutdown ends. And so I think what I'd like to ask, just to understand the situation a little bit more, and I realize that, you know, you're not interior, but you know what's happening in interior. Are there aspects of interior that should, in fact, be functioning on an essential personnel basis, first of all? And I'm not sure who's best to ask, maybe Mr. McConville, if you know. What's happening in interior that you agree they need to stay open and operating? And contrast that to what they're actually doing for oil and gas, for permitting and the rest of that.
Yeah, I'll do my best and invite others to fill in. There are essential activities, including emergency, things that are services that are necessary to protect human health and safety that they've determined are going, and I can't probably list those, but we could certainly get back to you. There are activities that are not happening that certainly are having a broader, more grave impact than what we've been discussing to make sure the oil and gas industry is happy and feels well served. We talked quite a bit about national parks, wildlife refuges, and other public lands where you see emergency circumstances playing out in real time, illegal road building, off-roading, likely preventable deaths and injuries because of the lack of visitor services, wildlife harassment, and the like.
I'm sorry, so you regard those as essential services, and those are not being classified as essential, they're not being provided, is that correct?
Those are some of the many services that are not being provided,
Okay.
That's right.
So public safety issues.
Public safety issues are certainly breaking out in these lands that are open but not adequately staffed, yeah.
Okay, and then contrast that to continued processing of permits for the oil and gas industry. What's essential about that? Is there a connection? Is there some, critical function where the oil and gas industry will somehow collapse if those permits are not, processed timely during this shutdown? I mean, contrast that to what we just talked about for essential services that are not being provided, that are public safety related.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the consequence to the oil and gas industry, or anybody else for that matter, who's applying for a permit? Lots of permits are applied for from Interior, so I don't want to necessarily single out the oil and gas industry. But what's going to happen to them if their permit processing is delayed?
Well, I would agree with Mr. Matzner's point about the lack of urgency, really. There are more than enough areas open for lease that are not currently being developed. There are more than enough permits out there that sit unused by oil and gas companies, and so the idea that more leases need to be stockpiled, more land needs to be locked up, more permits need to be rushed out the door when the public's not able to know what's going on, participate, or the experts who need to be there to weigh in on those decisions seems outrageous to us.
I would add just two things to that. I would just add one or two things to that. One of them is that number is like 30% for offshore. Only 30% of the held leases offshore are actually producing. We are in the middle of a global oil glut. Recent lease sales that have taken place before the shutdown got very low industry interest. And we're currently exporting oil at a massive scale in this country, more so than ever. So the consequences seem paltry in comparison to permanent degradation of sacred sites, to loss of life, to the pollution that's being dumped into our national parks, and some of the other examples my colleagues have made. To a certain degree, the entire country here is waiting for a resolution of the shutdown, except for the oil and gas industry. And what they're doing is trying to rush ahead to stockpile as many leases as they can before they face the next election.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case, and again, welcome back to Congress.
Thank you. I think it was maybe the wrong time to come back, but that's all right.
No, after listening to your questions, it was exactly the right time for you to come back. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce for questions our chair, Chair Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowenthal, and thank you and the staff for putting this together. It's not only timely, it's important to get out information about this issue, and I just have a couple of questions. I think one, Governor Riley, tribal consultation is required by the National Historic Preservation Act. What has been your interaction with BLM during the shutdown? Have we fulfilled, has the federal government fulfilled its consultation requirements and obligations?
Thank you for the question, Chairman and members of the committee. I am not currently in office, and so I don't play an active role as governor in the consultation process, but what I do understand is that it is a responsibility whenever there is a federal undertaking, which permitting is a federal undertaking, that tribes be consulted. In our area in New Mexico and the Southwest, I've often said this before, that anytime you put a shovel into the ground, there's a high potential for anyone to expose cultural resources, archaeological artifacts in that area. So on federal lands, it is even more important, especially in the areas of Chaco Canyon, which I talked about previously. We have proposed, and ACOMA has become well noted for its rapid ethnographic surveys that it conducts. What we do is we get our cultural experts on the ground, physically walk the ground, and identify not only well-recognized archaeological sites, but cultural sites and cultural artifacts that are on the ground. We understand that tribal consultation under the National Historic Preservation Act does not stop any type of development. What the Pueblos are concerned with is that we are not being consulted well ahead of time in order to advise a federal agency like BLM to avoid certain areas because of the National Historic Preservation Act, to protect any area that is of potential significance for preservation. And so we have been at a loss as well because Chaco Canyon and the whole historic area there are under the jurisdiction of two different entities. The Farmington Field Office and the Rio Perco Field Office overlap in those areas. And last year it was my experience that the two districts differ in how that federal process of tribal consultation occurs. In one district, the Farmington Field Office did not want to do anything but a Tier 1 survey, which is a document research of the written records of the federal agencies. The Rio Perco Field Office, however, wanted us to do and work with us to do a Tier 3, which is what I was talking about, an up-to-date current survey of a parcel of land. And so what we understand is tribal consultation, who are the real experts of any Puebloan area that can readily identify not only archaeological but cultural landscape entities that we want to protect. Who else better to do that than Pueblo people themselves? And so we're at a loss as to differences in how districts perceive tribal consultation, but as we've said all along, tribal consultation to us means that we are there at the very beginning of a project, during a project. We will get projects done on time and under budget, but if we are brought late in the game, then it's already too late. So for myself, my experience, it varies, but what I've heard today is that essential services do not really, I guess, fit into the mold if permitting is currently going on. To me, that personally, that's not essential services. That should be provided by BLM.
It's a complaint from Indian country in general and sovereign nations as a whole that the inconsistencies and the application of consultation is not uniform and not consistent across agencies and in relationship to tribes. So thank you for that. Mr. Pushkar, it seems pretty clear the administration's, in my mind, playing favorites. Recently, the president of the American Petroleum Institute said, and I quote, that they have not seen any major effects of the shutdown on our industry. Would you say that your industry has seen major effects of the shutdown? And do you think this is fair?
I would certainly say, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. We have seen profound impacts. We've seen impacts in workers being laid off or made to work without pay. We've seen losses in revenues. More than anything, though, we see the opportunity costs. We're going to have to now enter new seasons once we hope the federal government actually will open. We're going to have to enter a place where recreation enhancement fees have been spent down. Those are often the fees, those monies can be leveraged by nonprofit partners to do great work on our public lands. How far are those accounts going to be spent down? We're concerned that as we lose revenue today, we'll have less to invest in conservation service corps to do trail work. We'll have less money to work on deferred maintenance projects, less money to do education programs.
If the shutdown, God willing, and the creek don't rise, were to end tomorrow, or today, how long would it take our nonprofit partners and even some private entities to recover?
Depends on a couple of variables. If in reopening the government, Congress makes provision for nonprofit entities to be paid back for the investments they've made to keep visitor centers and facilities open, that will help. If we find that fee accounts haven't been spent down as far, that will help. If we continue to have vigilance in ensuring that cooperative agreements and grants, many of which will need to be modified to continue ongoing work, if there is vigilance from this committee and elsewhere to ensure those are processed quickly, so that money that was allocated for use on improving and enhancing our public lands can actually be spent, that will help.
Mr. Matzner, Mr. McConville, BOMA is saying that their rationale for bringing back employees to work on oil and gas leasing programs is that these employees are needed to comply with the administration's America First energy strategy. Compared to oil and gas industry, how are renewable energy projects being treated during this shutdown? And does that tell us anything about America's First energy dominance strategy, what it really means? Both of you or either one?
My colleague's given me the courtesy of going first. Thank you, Drew. So I think that the answer is pretty obvious from looking at what's been in at least in the written explanations from BOEM. We have seen no parallel directive to advance at an urgent basis clean energy, including offshore wind. That's striking in that it's actually a clean energy sector that's the fastest growing energy sector in the United States. It's also striking that it's really the clean energy race that's being run by the rest of the world. So we're essentially benching clean energy while running full steam ahead with the fossil fuels of the past.
Sir?
And I think you're seeing a very similar trend onshore. Solar, wind, geothermal projects are basically at a standstill. We believe that geothermal projects are being hit particularly hard. We know of at least one producer with 200 megawatts of capacity project that's being delayed as a result of this, and that's more than 2,000 construction jobs on the line. And what's most outrageous for the folks in industry we talk to is that the very similar, the same permits that BLM is issuing as quickly as possible to oil and gas industry are all that they need, but staff are being instructed to work on oil and gas permits and not renewables.
Thank you. The risks that this shutdown poses long-term for both of you, again, for renewable energy development on public lands. Does it make our public lands more attractive or less attractive place for companies that are promoting or developing renewable energy in the future as we go forward after this shutdown?
Yeah, thank you for the important question. I think it makes it a lot less attractive. The obvious favoritism that we're seeing so starkly during the shutdown, the delays that are happening on these renewable projects that, unlike the oil and gas industry, are greatly needed and underserved, are certainly going to make it less attractive, we believe, to industry to want to rely on the federal government and development on federal lands. And of course, the shutdown is just the latest stage in a saga where we see the Department of Interior showing that similar favoritism, making it easy for one type of energy and and clearly less favoritism and more challenges for others.
Thank you. Sir?
I would add, looping back to your previous also important question, that I think that what we're seeing during the shutdown is sort of a magnifying glass that's exposing the energy policy of this administration for what it is. It's lifting the veil, very thin veil, that they're not really interested in energy. They're interested in serving the oil and gas industry specifically, despite the climate crisis, despite the fact that clean energy is what we need to fuel the future and despite the fact that we're becoming less competitive internationally because we're falling behind. So I think it's important to get through this shutdown, to end the shutdown, but it's also important to put the resources back where they are really most needed, and that's in developing clean energy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lee Ashley, in your experience with a DOI, how important is it that the DOI's agencies work with each other and be available to the public during and through the EIS process? Do the furlong land management and wildlife experts at the Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, have relevance to BLM's work in the Arctic Refuge?
Thank you for the question. It's impossible to do a reasonable environmental impact statement on any oil and gas drilling project on public lands without the support, consultation, expertise of the Fish and Wildlife Service, in many cases the National Park Service, consultation with tribes. It is intrinsically a multi-agency effort. Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in particular, the administration put out a draft environmental impact statement in December that was deeply flawed. It failed to account for the impacts of drilling on polar bear populations, underestimated impacts on caribou, et cetera. That drilling is slated to happen in a national wildlife refuge. The Fish and Wildlife Service has the expertise about that refuge. Those biologists, those professionals of the Fish and Wildlife Service are not at work right now. They're not able to inform that draft environmental impact statement. So we're going to see a corrupted process for the environmental review.
Yeah, and despite the shutdown, BLM has been moving forward with holding, scheduling public hearings in areas like the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, the Arctic Refuge that you just mentioned, while processing at the same time oil and gas permits across the nation. What effect do you think? You said, and I think you just, to reiterate the last sentence that you made, which I think is very important for all of us, on the other agencies that are involved in these decision-making process, whose staff members are not allowed to work, and the public.
If you're a member of the public and are offered the opportunity to provide input on a drilling plan that may be near your community, you want to be able to read the documents that the government has laid out there explaining what will happen. And not just that, but potentially talk to some staff and get some plain language explanation of where drilling is going to happen and under what circumstances. The public can't get those questions answered right now. So public comment right now with the government shutdown is meaningless. And so the outcomes, the decisions that are going to come from paper public comment periods right now are all going to be meaningless, and they're going to be subject to litigation, and we're going to be in chaos here in a few months as the courts have to unravel the mess that's unfolding right now.
The point being that as a consequence of continuing the work of BLM
Correct.
during this process, absent the consultation and input and required advice of other agencies, we're setting this whole thing up for litigation, whether we like it or not.
Correct.
And this shutdown is going to contribute to that.
Correct.
Mr. Lowenthal, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity, and want to thank the witnesses very much, trying to highlight what I think is something important, that somebody used lifting the veil, thin veil, and corrupted was another word. I think shameless is an appropriate word as well, that anybody that thought that there was a level of multi-use and still involved in interior, anyone who felt that the scales weren't being tipped in the favor of industry at the expense of everybody else, this shutdown has brought that to a glaring reality, and that is that we continue to do this and shamelessly converting BLM into a real estate broker as opposed to doing the job they're supposed to do. Thank you very much, Mr. Lowenthal, and this is a good hearing, and I hope people are listening to the witnesses that you called forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let me be clear. BLM is moving forward with permits, but yet the public is excluded, consultation is excluded, we've shortened the process, we've defined America's energy needs, as only oil and gas. I haven't heard anything really besides what was brought up about renewable. And actually, in the context of what you brought up, you said they're not receiving the same benefits. So I want to follow up with what the chair has said. I want all the panelists to kind of answer. Do we have a legal case? This seems to me as outrageous what they're doing. During a shutdown, benefiting one industry and excluding everything else, defining America's energy interests as only oil and gas. I would like to know, and doing this by excluding what law says they're supposed to follow, whether it's NEPA, whether it's preservation, whether it's consultation, whether it's extending the comment period. I'm just shocked that this is all going on. So I would like to ask all the rest of the panelists, do we have a good legal case? Anybody?
I guess I will start. I think we're only beginning to count how many laws are potentially being broken right now. It starts with the Anti-Deficiency Act. Congress, I think, has been very clear that agencies are not supposed to spend money that they don't have. So I think one important question to answer right out of the gate is, where is this money coming from? Show us the money. Show us your accounts. Those documents are sitting in the Interior Department's budget office today. They know
That's what you mentioned in your testimony
those
about.
documents should be
Where's
over
the
here.
documentation?
And a decision could be made about whether, in fact, they are violating the Anti-Deficiency Act on some of these decisions. But beyond that, there are questions about violations of the National Park Service Organic Act, Fish and Wildlife Services, Refuge Management System Act, on and on and on, NEPA, not to mention others. This is going to be a mess for some time to come because the rule of law is not being carefully followed. There's not an orderly process for this shutdown. It is painful. There's no way to avoid the pain of a shutdown, unfortunately. But it is being managed very poorly.
Anyone else want to comment on some of the legal issues? Mr. Matzner.
Yes, I'm not a lawyer, but I know a lot of lawyers, and I think that there are going to be a lot of scrutiny over, as my colleague said. And I think what we can say now is, whether we know it's illegal or not yet is undecided, but I think we know it's scandalous and it should stop.
Anyone else? Mr. McConville.
Yeah, and I don't want to repeat what
It's okay to repeat.
Matt and Franz also
It's
said.
worth
but,
saying. You can say it again.
I mean, it does seem to us, and well, first of all, I think it is up to Deputy Secretary Bernhardt to come forward and explain what the department is doing, what justification they have for spending those resources that they claim to have, and for the decisions on how those resources are being used. So a lot of things are in the dark, and as it's incredibly important, all the efforts you all are doing to bring answers forward, try to get answers forward, will help us answer some of these tough questions, but questions about, but duties to have public participation, tribal consultation, to evaluate the environmental and historic impacts and consider them fully and before decisions are made. Those are not optional duties, so it seems pretty clear that they've got some legal issues on their hands in addition to scandalous activities.
All right. Anybody else want? Mr. Riley, Governor Riley.
I also want to echo that I'm not a lawyer, but I've had to become a student of federal Indian law as well in my tenure as governor for the Pueblo of Acoma. And having been a former Indian Health Service employee as well, a commissioned officer in the Public Health Service, I felt that I myself as a federal employee was a trustee of the Native populations that I served. So when I became governor, I also realized, sitting on now the other side of the table, that any federal agency is acting on behalf of the federal government as a trustee in its relationship with Pueblos, tribes, and nations of this country. And so these current circumstances with especially the Bureau of Land Management, are they acting as a good trustee? In my opinion, that's a big question that the current governors of the Pueblos are going to have to answer themselves. If they are a good trustee, then they should have looked at all the acts that apply and especially tribal consultation. Tribal consultation is an ongoing conversation. It is not a one-time interaction. In that aspect, there's give and take. We understand that the National Historic Preservation Act does not stop any development on federal lands. However, without being given that opportunity to provide input into the preservation of our cultural and religious resources, the trustee is not acting in our best interest. And so, is it illegal? Is it teeing up some legal action? I think that's going to have to be a decision made by each of the Pueblo governors. However, the National Congress of American Indians has also been very vocal on a number of issues on behalf of Pueblo's tribes and nations. The All Pueblo Council of Governors have already made a position well known. And so the Pueblo of Acoma, I know, has also, during my tenure and currently under Governor Valle, has already taken the first steps to notify the federal government that they are delinquent in their trusteeship as well. So I can't answer that question, but I'm just providing my perspective on during my tenure that that's what I am seeing with many federal agencies. They are not acting in good stead as a trustee to the Pueblo's tribes and nations in this country. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have one more last question, and it's kind of interesting. We've heard from the panelists. I think the committee also was very concerned about this, the trampling on environmental law, the trampling on public input, the trampling on comment period, the lack of consultation between agencies. And so that's one whole area. The other area is the decision by, I guess, Interior, really, or really BOEM or BLM, to say that America's energy needs only have to do with oil and gas. So I have a question for Mr. Matzner. We've heard nothing about, expediting other projects. You did mention it before, that you haven't. And I know that you know much about the Vineyard Project, which is off the coast of Rhode Island, I believe it is. BOEM is currently reviewing a proposal to build our nation's first ever commercial scale offshore wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island. Critically important for the nation's national security and the nation's moving forward. So have they received expedited permitting? Have they received the same equal treatment under the law that oil and gas have received?
Unfortunately, I myself am not a deep expert on that particular project, but
Okay.
my understanding is that the short answer is no, that the project has essentially ground to a halt. The interested parties are very frustrated at the lack of response that they're receiving, and I would speculate that when you look across the aisle and see statements from the oil and gas industry bragging that they've had no impacts from this shutdown that's ground the country to a halt, and these particular clean energy projects are as well, that the frustration is only mounting. And as my colleague said, it's not just this one project we're talking about. We're talking about a persistent pitting of energy against the environment, which is a choice we don't have to make in this country. We have clean energy in our driveways, on our roofs. It's the wave of the future. Everyone recognizes that, from the consumer that wants more choice to our international leaders across the globe, other than maybe one guy.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask the same question to other people. You may not be involved or experts in the area, but are you aware of that any of the renewable energy projects are receiving the same expedited process, or are they being treated unequally?
They are being treated unequally from everything we have gathered when it comes to onshore renewables, and that's solar, wind, geothermal, all those projects and processes that BLM is responsible for are at a standstill, and that's thousands of jobs on the line. I mentioned a geothermal project of 200 megawatts that's in limbo. They're feeling the hit on this, like so many other parts of our economy. But clearly, the oil and gas industry is in a different class.
Oh, well, I'll save that for final comment. Mr. Case, do you have any more questions?
Thank you, Chair. I unfortunately am a lawyer, and I agree with Mr. Lee Ashley that this is a lot of litigation waiting to happen, but a lot of damage can be done before you get to litigation. So it needs to be highlighted right now. And actually, listening to the testimony, being a lawyer, including being an in-house lawyer for a company, my observation is that the opportunity presented by this shutdown to rush things through the Department of the Interior by the oil and gas companies must be so incredible as to make worthwhile the risk of the litigation later on. That's what I think, listening to your testimony. So can I just go back to one thing to just clarify this for the record? The comment period, it is sticking in my mind that there's a very conscious effort to cut off comment periods, notwithstanding the shutdown. And can one of you, maybe Mr. Lee Ashley, what is that really all about? What is the consequence of maintaining an original comment period despite the availability of staff, despite the availability of resources in which to effectively comment during that comment period, and thus the, as you called it, corruption of the documents that are produced as a result of that comment period? And I mean, this is important stuff. We're not talking about National Petroleum Reserve, Arctic National Wildlife. These are some of the biggest decisions that we have to make here. So what's happening with that focus on maintaining an original comment period in the middle of a government shutdown?
That's a great question. I think it might be a little akin to the committee calling a hearing, asking the public to come, but then locking the doors and not letting anybody in or turning off the TVs. So there has to, for public comment period to actually inform the decision and for people to feel like they have a chance to inform the decision, they have to have access to all that information. And I think you are right to highlight that there are meaningful consequences to making these decisions without the input of the public, other agencies, and professionals. We're talking about drilling the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, Western Arctic with the National Petroleum Reserve, and then a series of lease sales coming up potentially in February and March across the West that put places like Chaco Canyon at risk, the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. If those leases are sold, if we charge ahead with the Arctic Refuge with incomplete information, without the adequate analysis done, you can't unring that bell. Those places are gone. So there are on-the-ground consequences of the corruption of these public comment periods.
Thank you very much. And I just want to thank the panelists on this very illuminating hearing, which I consider the short kind of definition is all energy projects are equal, except some oil and gas are more equal than anything else. And I think that's the emphasis, the trampling on our protections, on our environmental safeguards has occurred, and also I'm really struck with what was put out by, I think it's, now I'm going to get my name, Mr. Lee Ashley, in that, show me the money. Where is the money coming from? They are claiming that, oh, they have unspent money. Where did that come from? How much was there? What other money is you know, a shutdown is a shutdown. But this is not, there is no shutdown for oil and gas, and that's outrageous, and I thank you all for coming. And with it.
Would you like to ask them what question they didn't receive? Just gives them the last moment to kind of say a concluding remark if they like.
Thank you. That's not what I wanted to do.